April 15th, 1945. The small Bavarian town of Berchtesgaden lay shrouded in morning mist, its alpine beauty untouched by the devastation that had ravaged much of Germany. 32-year-old Elsa Müller stood at her cottage window, clutching a telegram that confirmed what she had suspected for months. Her husband, Friedrich, would never return from the Eastern Front. She believed the Americans would treat her harshly when they arrived, perhaps even more so as the widow of a German officer. Little did she know that the man assigned to requisition her home would become her unexpected protector in the chaotic aftermath of a world torn apart. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how unexpected compassion between supposed enemies revealed the true cost of ideological blindness, and how two people from opposing sides discovered their shared humanity. Amid the ruins of the most devastating conflict in human history, the distant rumble of engines broke the morning silence as Elsa folded the telegram and tucked it into her pocket. American forces were approaching Berchtesgaden, having pushed through southern Germany with remarkable speed. Intelligence reports from the front lines had indicated that the Allied forces were only days away, but the sound of vehicles suggested they had arrived sooner than expected. Elsa had prepared herself as best she could. The pantry contained enough preserved food to last several weeks. The cellar held firewood and emergency supplies. Her modest home, inherited from her parents, stood somewhat isolated at the edge of town, which she hoped might spare her from the immediate attention of occupying forces. Still, as the widow of Hauptmann Friedrich Müller of the German Sixth Army, she harbored no illusions about receiving special treatment. Major Thomas Sullivan of the United States Army's 28th Infantry Division guided his jeep along the winding road leading into Berchtesgaden. At 38, he was older than many of his fellow officers, having joined the military after years as a history professor at Princeton University. His expertise in European history and fluency in German had made him valuable to intelligence operations, though he found himself increasingly tasked with administrative duties as the fighting subsided. "Beautiful country," remarked Sergeant Frank Donovan, who sat beside him. "Hard to believe we're in the same Germany we've been fighting through." Sullivan nodded. This region was largely spared from bombing. Strategic targets were concentrated elsewhere. "Lucky for them," Donovan said, his voice tinged with bitterness. The sergeant had lost his brother at Normandy and carried that grief like a physical weight. "We're here to establish order, Sergeant," Sullivan reminded him. "Not to seek retribution." "Yes, sir," Donovan replied, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. Their jeep was followed by 3 trucks carrying soldiers from their division. Their orders were to secure the town, establish a command post, and begin the process of denazification and reconstruction. Sullivan had been given authority to requisition suitable properties for military use, and he carried a list of homes identified by intelligence as belonging to high-ranking party members or military officers. Elsa heard the vehicles stop outside her gate. She smoothed her simple grey dress, took a deep breath and prepared to face whatever came next. The knock at her door was firm but not aggressive. When she opened it, she found herself facing a tall American officer whose weathered face suggested he was closer to 40 than 30. His uniform was immaculate, his posture straight, but his eyes, a deep, thoughtful blue, lacked the hardness she had expected. "Good morning," he said in nearly perfect German. "I am Major Thomas Sullivan of the United States Army." Elsa nodded stiffly. "Elsa Müller," she responded, offering nothing more. "Mrs. Müller, I have orders to assess properties in this area for potential requisition by Allied forces," Sullivan continued, his tone professional but not unkind. "May I come in?" She stepped aside, allowing him entry. Sergeant Donovan and 2 other soldiers remained outside, watching the surrounding area with wary eyes. Sullivan took in the modest interior of the cottage. It was clean and well-maintained, with simple furniture and few decorations. There were no photographs of Hitler, no swastikas or other party emblems, unusual for a German household during the war years. "You live here alone?" Sullivan asked, noticing the absence of men's belongings. "My husband was in the Sixth Army," Elsa replied, her voice steady. "He will not be returning." Sullivan's expression softened slightly. The Sixth Army had been devastated at Stalingrad, with most of its soldiers either perished or captured by Soviet forces. Few prisoners taken by the Soviets had survived. "I am sorry for your loss," he said, the words automatic but sincere. Elsa's eyes flashed with momentary surprise before her expression returned to careful neutrality. "Thank you," she said quietly. Sullivan continued his inspection of the house, noting its 3 bedrooms, functional kitchen, and sturdy construction. It would make suitable officers' quarters, especially given its somewhat secluded location. "Mrs. Muller, I must inform you that this property will be requisitioned for use by Allied military personnel," he stated, returning to the living room where Elsa stood with her hands clasped before her. "When must I leave?" she asked, her voice betraying no emotion. "You misunderstand," Sullivan replied. "You are not being evicted. However, you will be required to provide accommodations and basic household services to assigned personnel." Elsa's face paled. She had heard rumors about what happened to German women in areas occupied by Soviet forces. Even the Americans and British had their share of troubling incidents. Seeing her reaction, Sullivan quickly added, "You will be compensated for your services, and you will be treated with respect. This is not punishment, Mrs. Muller. It is simply a necessary measure given our need for adequate accommodations." His words did little to reassure her. "When will these personnel arrive?" "I will be taking one of the rooms myself, effective immediately," Sullivan informed her. "2 of my junior officers will be assigned the other rooms within the week. We require breakfast and dinner, laundry services, and basic upkeep of the premises." "I understand," Elsa replied, though her rigid posture and tight expression suggested otherwise. Sullivan hesitated before adding, "My men and I have been fighting for many months, Mrs. Muller. We are tired, and we are far from home. I can assure you that we desire nothing more than basic comfort and civility." Before she could respond, Sergeant Donovan appeared at the door. "Major, we've got a situation in the town square. Civilians are gathering, and some look agitated." Sullivan nodded. "I'll be right there." He turned back to Elsa. "I'll return this evening with my belongings. Please prepare the larger bedroom." After the Americans departed, Elsa sank into a chair, her composure finally breaking. Tears streamed down her face. Tears for Friedrich, tears for Germany, tears for herself, and the uncertain future that lay ahead. When the initial wave of emotion passed, she rose with determination. If she was to survive, she would need to adapt. She had endured 6 years of war. She would endure this too. By late afternoon, Elsa had prepared the master bedroom for Major Sullivan. She had changed the linens, dusted thoroughly, and ensured the room was properly ventilated. The familiar routine of housework provided some comfort amid the turmoil of the day. At precisely 1800 hours, Sullivan returned, carrying a modest duffel bag and a small wooden case. He was accompanied by Sergeant Donovan, who surveyed the house with obvious suspicion. "Mrs. Muller," Sullivan greeted her, "thank you for preparing the room. I trust there were no problems during our absence." "None," Elsa replied curtly. "Good. I've brought rations that should supplement your own supplies," Sullivan said, gesturing to a box that Donovan carried. "Coffee, sugar, canned goods, items that I imagine have been scarce." The gesture caught Elsa off guard. Rationing had been increasingly severe in the final years of the war, with many basic items becoming unobtainable luxuries. The sight of real coffee beans made her mouth water involuntarily. "That is unexpected," she admitted. "Thank you." "Sergeant Donovan will be stationed outside tonight for security purposes," Sullivan explained. "He will be relieved by Private Jenkins in the morning." Donovan set down the box of supplies and gave Elsa a hard look. "Ma'am," he said with a curt nod before returning outside. "He doesn't trust me," Elsa observed after the sergeant had gone. "Sergeant Donovan has seen a great deal of combat," Sullivan explained. "Trust doesn't come easily to any of us anymore." That evening, Elsa prepared a simple meal from her own supplies, potato soup with herbs from her small garden. She set the table for 2, a domestic normality that felt strangely discordant amid the circumstances. Sullivan arrived at the table precisely on time, now dressed in a clean uniform with his major's insignia gleaming. He stood behind his chair, waiting until Elsa had seated herself before taking his own seat, a courtesy she had not expected. They ate in silence for several minutes before Sullivan spoke. "This is excellent soup, Mrs. Miller." "There is little to work with these days," she replied. "Yet you've managed to create something flavorful from simple ingredients. That requires skill." Elsa looked up from her bowl, studying the American's face for signs of mockery. Finding none, she offered a cautious, "Thank you." "Were you born in Berchtesgaden?" Sullivan asked, attempting to establish some normal conversation. "Yes, my family has lived here for 3 generations. My father was the town physician." Sullivan nodded thoughtfully. "A respected profession. And your husband? Was he from here as well?" Elsa tensed at the mention of Friedrich. "No, we met in Munich, at university. I was studying literature. He was in military school. That was in 1934. Before things became complicated," Sullivan observed diplomatically. "Yes, before." Her tone made it clear she didn't wish to elaborate further. Sullivan respected her reticence and changed the subject. "I've been authorized to hire local civilians for various tasks related to the occupation. Translation, administrative work, reconstruction efforts. Given your education, you might be qualified for something more suited to your abilities than household services." Elsa's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. "Why would you offer that?" "Because it's practical," Sullivan replied simply. "We need educated, capable people to help restore order and basic services. University education is valuable." "Even from a German?" "From anyone with the necessary skills," and Sullivan corrected. "This war is effectively over, Mrs. Muller. Now comes the difficult task of rebuilding." Elsa considered his words carefully. "I will think about it," she said finally. After dinner, Sullivan retired to his room with a book, a volume of Hemingway that Elsa glimpsed as he passed. She cleaned the kitchen and then retreated to the smallest bedroom, which she had claimed for herself after preparing the other rooms for the American officers. As she lay in bed that night, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of an American soldier pacing outside her home, Elsa reflected on the unexpected turn her life had taken. The enemy she had been taught to fear was now sleeping under her roof, eating at her table, offering her employment. The world had been turned upside down and she was still trying to find her footing in this new reality. The next morning, Elsa woke before dawn, as had been her habit throughout the war years. She dressed quietly and made her way to the kitchen, startled to find Sullivan already seated at the table, a map spread before him. "Good morning, Mrs. Muller," he said without looking up. "You're an early riser." "As are you, Major," she replied, moving to the stove to begin breakfast preparations. "Military habit," he explained. "Though I was an early riser even before the war, my students often complained about my 8 o'clock lectures." This casual revelation that he had been a teacher, not a career soldier, caught Elsa's attention. "What did you teach?" she asked despite herself. "European history at Princeton University," Sullivan answered, finally looking up from his map. "Specializing in the medieval period, though I had a particular interest in the Prussian military tradition as well." "You speak German very well for an American," Elsa noted, as she began mixing batter for the precious flour she would use to make pancakes, a small concession to her new situation. "I spent 2 years studying in Heidelberg in the 1920s, Sullivan explained. "And I had German colleagues before the war. Language was always a passion of mine." This information shifted Elsa's perception of the man, not a career soldier, but an academic who understood something of German culture beyond the propaganda of war. "And now you are here, occupying the homes of your former hosts," she observed, unable to keep a hint of bitterness from her voice. Sullivan folded his map deliberately. "Yes, history has a way of taking unexpected turns, doesn't it? 6 years ago, I was lecturing about the Hanseatic League. Now I'm part of an occupying force in a country I once admired greatly." The frankness of his response surprised her. Most of the American soldiers she had observed from a distance maintained a victorious swagger, their contempt for the defeated Germans barely concealed. "You disapprove of the occupation?" she asked cautiously. "I understand its necessity," Sullivan replied diplomatically, "but I take no pleasure in it. My role, as I see it, is to ensure it proceeds with as much humanity as possible." Their conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Sergeant Donovan entered without waiting for a response. "Major, there's been an incident in town," he reported, casting a suspicious glance at Elsa. "Group of civilians confronted some of our men near the market square. Nothing serious yet, but tensions are rising." Sullivan stood immediately. "I'll handle it. Have Webster and Chen meet me there with a translator." "Already arranged, sir," Donovan confirmed. Sullivan turned to Elsa. "I apologize for cutting breakfast short, Mrs. Muller. Duty calls." After the Americans departed, Elsa continued her breakfast preparations mechanically. The conversation with Sullivan had unsettled her. He didn't fit neatly into her conception of what an American officer should be, and that made her situation all the more confusing. Later that morning, as Elsa was hanging laundry in the small yard behind the cottage, she heard raised voices from the road. A group of local women had gathered, eyeing her with undisguised hostility. At their head stood Margot Weber, the widow of a prominent local party official. "So the rumors are true," Margot called out, her voice carrying across the yard. "Elsa Muller," playing housemaid to the Americans. Elsa stiffened but continued with her task. "I'm doing what's necessary to survive, Margot, as are we all." "Is that what Friedrich would have wanted?" another woman challenged. "His widow serving those who defeated Germany?" "Friedrich is dead," Elsa replied bluntly, "along with millions of others who followed orders without question." Margot's face hardened. "You always were too clever for your own good, Elsa. Too many books, too many ideas. Now look at you. First, to collaborate with the enemy." "They requisitioned my home," Elsa stated flatly. "I had no choice in the matter." "There are always choices," Margot retorted. "Some of us still have pride, even in defeat." Before Elsa could respond, a military jeep appeared on the road. Sullivan sat in the passenger seat, his expression grave as he observed the confrontation. The vehicle stopped, and he stepped out, approaching the group of women with measured steps. "Is there a problem here, ladies?" he asked in German. The women fell silent, their defiance tempered by the reality of the American uniform before them. Margot recovered first. "No problem, Herr Major," she replied with exaggerated politeness. "We were just checking on our friend's welfare." Sullivan's gaze moved from Margot to Elsa and back again. "Mrs. Muller's welfare is now under the protection of the United States Army," he stated firmly. "Any concerns should be directed to my office in the town hall." The women dispersed quickly, though not without sending final glances of contempt toward Elsa. Margot was the last to leave, her parting words barely audible but clear enough to Elsa. "Traitor." When they were alone, Sullivan turned to Elsa. "Those women, friends of yours?" "Neighbors," Elsa corrected. "Friendship has been a luxury few could afford these past years." "They seemed hostile." "They see me housing an American officer and assume the worst," Elsa explained, returning to her laundry with renewed focus. "The worst being? That I am collaborating willingly, that I am betraying Germany." Sullivan considered this. "And are you? Collaborating willingly?" Elsa met his gaze directly. "I am doing what is necessary to survive, Major Sullivan. Nothing more, nothing less." "A pragmatic approach," Sullivan observed. "Not everyone would understand it." "Few have ever understood me," Elsa replied. "My husband did. Now he is gone." Sullivan nodded slowly. "The incident in town has been resolved for now. 2 of my men will be arriving this afternoon to occupy the remaining rooms. Lieutenant Garcia and Captain Lewis. Both are officers with administrative duties, not combat roles." "I will prepare their rooms," Elsa acknowledged. "One more thing," Sullivan added, reaching into his pocket. "Official paperwork identifying you as civilian staff for Allied forces. This should provide some protection against misunderstandings." He handed her a document bearing the Allied military government seal. The paper stated clearly that Elsa Muller was employed by the occupation authorities and was under their protection. "Thank you," she said, genuinely surprised by his foresight. "We're establishing a civil affairs office to address German civilian concerns," Sullivan continued. "Given your education and language skills, I've recommended you for a position there. 3 hours each morning, if you're interested. The pay would be separate from your compensation for housing services." Elsa stared at him, trying to understand his motives. "Why are you doing this?" Sullivan's expression remained neutral. As I said yesterday, it's practical. We need capable people. There must be others with similar qualifications. Perhaps, Sullivan conceded, but they haven't come to my attention yet. You have. That afternoon, the two additional American officers arrived. Lieutenant Michael Garcia was a young man of Mexican descent from California, his Spanish-accented German halting but enthusiastic. Captain James Lewis was older, perhaps in his mid-30s, with a clipped New England accent and a reserved manner. Elsa prepared dinner for the three officers that evening, a modest stew made with vegetables from her garden and preserved meat from her dwindling stores. The conversation around the table was polite but strained, with Garcia making most of the efforts to engage. "This is excellent, Mrs. Muller," Garcia said appreciatively. "Reminds me of my mother's cooking, though she uses more chili peppers." "Thank you, Lieutenant," Elsa replied. "Spices have been difficult to obtain these past years." "I bet," Lewis remarked, his tone suggesting little sympathy. "Tough to keep supply lines running when you're fighting the whole world." Sullivan shot his subordinate a warning glance. "Captain Lewis, I believe you have duty rosters to review this evening." Lewis nodded, chastened. "Yes, sir. I'll see to that after dinner." The meal continued in uncomfortable silence until Garcia attempted another conversational gambit. "I heard you studied literature, Mrs. Muller. Any favorite authors?" Elsa hesitated, unsure how to navigate such normal conversation with men who, until days ago, had been her enemies. "Goethe," she finally answered, "and Thomas Mann." "Mann?" Sullivan nodded approvingly. "I read The Magic Mountain before the war. Remarkable work." "You know he was driven into exile," Elsa said quietly. "His books were burned." A heavy silence fell over the table. The reality of what Germany had become under Nazi rule, what it had done to its own culture and people, hung in the air between them. Many good people were forced to flee, Sullivan acknowledged, or worse. "And many stayed and said nothing," Elsa added, her voice barely above a whisper, "including me." It was the closest she had come to a political statement, and Sullivan regarded her thoughtfully. "Few had the luxury of open dissent, Mrs. Muller." "Perhaps," she conceded, "but that does not absolve us of responsibility." The candor of her statement surprised all three officers. Garcia looked uncomfortable, while Lewis seemed reassessing his impression of their German hostess. Sullivan's expression remained unreadable, but something in his eyes suggested respect. After dinner, the officers retired to their respective rooms, leaving Elsa alone in the kitchen. As she washed the dishes, she reflected on the strange situation in which she found herself. These men, Americans, victors, occupiers, were now her housemates, their presence both a burden and, unexpectedly, a form of protection. Major Sullivan, in particular, defied her expectations with his knowledge of German literature and his seemingly genuine concern for fair treatment of civilians. Yet she remained wary. The war had taught her that survival often depended on caution, on revealing as little of oneself as possible. The Americans might seem civilized, even kind, but they were still representatives of a conquering power. Their goodwill could vanish as quickly as it had appeared. The following morning, Elsa rose early as usual to prepare breakfast before the officers began their day. She found Sullivan already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, reading a German newspaper that had resumed publication under Allied supervision. "Good morning, Mrs. Muller," he greeted her. "Did you sleep well?" "Well enough," she replied noncommittally, moving to the stove to begin cooking. Sullivan set aside his newspaper. "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday. Your comment about responsibility." Elsa tensed. Political discussions were dangerous territory, even, perhaps especially, with an American officer. "It was merely an observation," she said carefully. "A courageous one," Sullivan countered. "Many Germans are denying any knowledge of what happened under Hitler's regime." Elsa cracked eggs into a bowl with more force than necessary. "What good does acknowledgement do now? The dead remain dead." "It's a beginning," Sullivan suggested. "A necessary one if Germany is to rebuild not just its cities, but its soul." The philosophical turn of the conversation surprised her. You speak like a professor, not a soldier. I was a professor longer than I've been a soldier, Sullivan reminded her, and I will be one again when this is over. Before their conversation could continue, Garcia entered the kitchen, his uniform slightly rumpled, his expression cheerful despite the early hour. "Good morning," he called out. "Something smells wonderful, Mrs. Muller." Lewis followed shortly after, immaculately dressed and reserved as ever. The four of them sat down to breakfast, the conversation turning to the practicalities of the day ahead. "Mrs. Muller, if you're amenable, I'd like to take you to the Civil Affairs Office this morning," Sullivan said as they finished eating, "to introduce you to Major Richards, who oversees civilian employment." Elsa nodded, though uncertainty gnawed at her. Working directly for the Americans would only deepen her neighbor's suspicions of collaboration. Yet what choice did she have? The position offered stability, extra rations, and possibly some protection in these uncertain times. "I would like to see what the position entails," she said cautiously. After breakfast, Sullivan drove Elsa into town in his jeep, a privilege that drew stares from locals on the streets. Berchtesgaden had changed dramatically in just the few days since the Americans' arrival. Military vehicles were parked in the town square, checkpoints had been established at major intersections, and signs in English and German announced curfew hours and other regulations. The Civil Affairs Office had been set up in what was formerly the town administration building. As they entered, Elsa noted that most of the Nazi emblems had been removed, though lighter patches on the walls marked where they had hung. Major Richards was a brisk, efficient man in his 40s with a background in public administration before the war. He greeted Sullivan warmly and regarded Elsa with professional courtesy. "Mrs. Muller, Major Sullivan speaks highly of your qualifications," Richards said after introductions were complete. "We're in desperate need of individuals who can bridge the gap between our administration and the local population." "I'm not sure I'm the right person for such a role," Elsa admitted. "I have no experience in administration." "Your education and language skills are what interest us," Richards explained, "and frankly, your status as the widow of a German officer might actually be beneficial. It could help establish trust with civilians who view us with suspicion." The irony wasn't lost on Elsa. The Americans thought her connection to the German military would make her trustworthy to her fellow Germans, while her neighbors were already branding her a traitor for housing American officers. Richards outlined the position. 3 hours each morning, translating documents, helping German civilians navigate the new bureaucracy established by the occupation forces, and occasionally interpreting during meetings between American officials and local leaders. The pay was modest, but included extra ration coupons, a significant benefit given the food shortages that plagued post-war Germany. "Would you be willing to start tomorrow?" Richards asked after explaining the duties. Elsa glanced at Sullivan, who maintained a neutral expression, offering neither encouragement nor discouragement. The decision was hers alone. "Yes," she said finally, "I will start tomorrow." As they left the administration building, Sullivan turned to Elsa. "You seemed hesitant. Having second thoughts." "My neighbors already consider me a collaborator for housing you and your officers," Elsa explained. "Working directly for the occupation administration will only confirm their suspicions." Sullivan considered this. "Would you prefer I find other arrangements for our officers?" The offer surprised her. "You would do that?" "If it's causing you undue hardship, yes," Sullivan replied. "Though I admit the alternatives are limited at present." Elsa shook her head. "No, moving you elsewhere would only make things worse now. They would say I'd disappointed the Americans and been punished. Either way, I lose." "A difficult position," Sullivan acknowledged. "I'm becoming accustomed to those," Elsa said with unexpected dry humor. As they walked toward the jeep, a commotion erupted across the square. A group of American soldiers were confronting an elderly German man who was gesturing angrily. The situation was escalating rapidly, with the soldiers growing increasingly aggressive and the old man refusing to back down. Without hesitation, Sullivan strode toward the confrontation, Elsa following uncertainly behind him. "What's going on here?" Sullivan demanded as he approached. "This Kraut was trying to go around the checkpoint, sir," one of the soldiers explained. "When we stopped him, he got belligerent." The elderly man, seeing another officer, launched into a rapid explanation in German. Elsa listened, then turned to Sullivan. He says he was trying to reach his daughter's house to deliver medicine. His wife is ill, and his daughter is caring for her. The medicine came from the American medical station. He has a permit, but these soldiers wouldn't look at it. Sullivan turned to the elderly man. "May I see your permit, sir?" he asked in German. With trembling hands, the man produced a crumpled paper bearing the stamp of the Military Medical Corps. Sullivan examined it, then nodded. "This permit is valid," he told the soldiers. "In the future, take the time to examine documentation properly, even if there's a language barrier. That's what interpreters are for." "Yes, sir," the soldiers replied, though their expressions suggested resentment at being corrected in front of a German civilian. Sullivan turned back to the elderly man. "You're free to go, sir. Please accept our apologies for the misunderstanding." The man nodded curtly, his dignity somewhat restored by Sullivan's intervention. As he shuffled away, Sullivan watched him with a thoughtful expression. "That was well handled," Elsa observed quietly. "It shouldn't have happened in the first place," Sullivan replied. "Small incidents like that can quickly escalate into larger problems if not addressed properly." As they continued toward the jeep, Elsa noticed that several townspeople had witnessed the exchange. Their expressions ranged from surprise to cautious approval. Perhaps, she thought, there was a way forward through this difficult time. Not through grand gestures, but through small acts of decency and fairness. Back at the cottage, Elsa prepared for her first day at the Civil Affairs Office with mixed emotions. The position offered practical benefits, but it also placed her in a precarious social position among her fellow Germans. Yet as she considered Sullivan's intervention with the elderly man, she wondered if perhaps there was value in serving as a bridge between the occupiers and the occupied, in helping to ensure that such small acts of decency became the norm rather than the exception. That night, as she lay in bed listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the American officers moving about her home, Elsa allowed herself to acknowledge a surprising truth. For the first time since receiving news of Friedrich's death, she felt something akin to hope. Not happiness, certainly, but a tentative belief that survival might entail more than mere existence, that even amid defeat and occupation, there might be a path toward something resembling dignity and purpose. Elsa's first day at the Civil Affairs Office proved more challenging than she had anticipated. The building buzzed with activity as American personnel and German civilians navigated the complex process of establishing order in the aftermath of chaos. Major Richards assigned her to a small desk near the entrance, where she would serve as the initial point of contact for Germans seeking assistance. Her first visitor was an elderly woman whose home had been damaged during the American advance. The woman spoke no English, and her dialect was thick enough that even some Germans had difficulty understanding her. Elsa listened patiently, then translated her concerns to the American lieutenant responsible for property damage claims. When the lieutenant explained that the process would take weeks, Elsa conveyed this news gently, adding suggestions for temporary solutions the woman hadn't considered. "You have a way with people," remarked Captain Sarah Bennett, an American WAC officer who had been observing the exchange. "Most of our translators just relay the words. You're actually helping them understand. Understanding goes beyond language," Elsa replied simply. By midday, Elsa had assisted more than 20 civilians with various concerns. Some regarded her with suspicion upon learning her name, recognizing her as the widow of a German officer now working for the Americans. Others seemed relieved to find someone who could navigate both worlds and advocate for their needs. As her shift ended, Major Richards approached her desk. "Excellent work today, Mrs. Miller. You've already improved our efficiency considerably." "Thank you," Elsa replied, gathering her belongings, "though I'm not sure all my neighbors would share your assessment." Richards frowned. "Have you experienced harassment because of your position here?" "Not directly," Elsa assured him, "but there are whispers, looks. It's to be expected." "Report any incidents immediately," Richards instructed. "Major Sullivan has emphasized that staff safety is a priority." The mention of Sullivan's concern caught Elsa by surprise. "Major Sullivan discussed me specifically?" Richards nodded. He was quite insistent that you receive full protection as a civilian employee. Said something about your situation being particularly delicate, given your background. As Elsa left the building, she pondered this information. Sullivan's protection extended beyond mere professional courtesy, it seemed. She wondered what motivated him, whether it was simply his historian's appreciation for complex situations or something more personal. Walking through the town square, Elsa encountered Margot Weber and her circle of friends outside the newly reopened market. The women fell silent as she approached, their hostile stares making their feelings clear. "Good morning, ladies," Elsa greeted them with forced politeness. "Working for the Americans now, I hear," Margot said, her voice dripping with contempt. "Translating their orders to good Germans. Helping our neighbors navigate a difficult situation," Elsa corrected calmly. "Someone must ensure our people are treated fairly," another woman scoffed. "And you think they'll listen to you? A woman? The Americans are no different from any other men with power." "Perhaps not," Elsa acknowledged. "But isn't it better to try than to simply suffer in silence?" Before the confrontation could escalate, a voice called out from across the square, "Mrs. Müller." Lieutenant Garcia approached, his youthful face bright with enthusiasm, despite the tension evident in the group of women. "Major Sullivan asked me to escort you home if I saw you in town. He mentioned concerns about, local attitudes." The women dispersed quickly, though not without final glares of disapproval. Elsa found herself simultaneously grateful for the intervention and uncomfortable with the implications. Was she now under American protection, even outside of working hours? "Thank you, Lieutenant," she said, as they began walking toward her cottage. "Though I'm capable of finding my own way home," Garcia nodded. "Of course, ma'am. The Major just thought." "Well, transitions like this can be complicated. Not everyone understands people who try to bridge both sides." "And which side do you believe I'm on, Lieutenant?" Elsa asked directly. The young officer considered the question thoughtfully. "I don't think it's about sides anymore, ma'am. The war's over. Now it's about moving forward, rebuilding. People like you who can help with that are valuable, no matter what uniform they wore before." His perspective surprised her, more nuanced than she had expected from someone so young. "You're quite philosophical for a soldier." Garcia smiled. "I was studying philosophy at Berkeley when Pearl Harbor happened, enlisted the next day, planning to go back and finish when all this is done." "And what does a philosopher make of occupation duty?" Elsa inquired, genuinely curious. "It's complicated," Garcia admitted. "We won the war, but winning the peace, that's harder. Requires understanding, not just force. That's why people like you matter, Mrs. Müller. You help us understand." When they reached the cottage, Sullivan was in the garden, examining Elsa's modest vegetable plot with apparent interest. He straightened as they approached. "Lieutenant, Mrs. Müller, I see you found each other in town." "Yes, sir," Garcia confirmed, "just as you suggested." Sullivan nodded. "Thank you, Lieutenant. You're dismissed." After Garcia departed, Sullivan turned to Elsa. "How was your first day?" "Busy," she replied. "And informative. I learned that you've requested special protection for me." Sullivan's expression remained neutral. "It seemed prudent, given your unique position." "My unique position," Elsa repeated, "as a German working for Americans, or as the widow of a German officer housing an American major?" "Both," Sullivan acknowledged, "and as someone willing to build bridges at a time when most people are still focused on the chasms between us." Elsa studied him, trying to discern his true motivations. "Major Sullivan, I appreciate your concern, but I've survived 6 years of war without protection. I don't need an American escort to walk through my own town." "With respect, Mrs. Müller, the dangers now are different," Sullivan countered. "During the war, the lines were clear. Now they're blurred, and those caught in between often suffer most. Like those who collaborate with occupiers," Elsa suggested. "Like those who choose a difficult path toward reconciliation rather than clinging to comfortable hatred," Sullivan corrected gently. His words resonated with unexpected truth. Elsa had indeed chosen a difficult path, not out of political conviction or opportunism, but from a pragmatic recognition that the future required engagement rather than bitter resistance. "I'm preparing dinner," she said, changing the subject. It will be ready in an hour. Sullivan nodded, accepting the conversation's end. I'll inform Captain Lewis and Lieutenant Garcia. That evening, as the officers gathered around her table, Elsa observed their interactions with new interest. Lewis remained formal and somewhat distant. Though his initial hostility had softened to professional courtesy, Garcia was enthusiastic and inquisitive, eager to learn about German culture and share stories of his home in California. And Sullivan, the complex, thoughtful historian turned soldier, maintained a careful balance between military authority and human decency. Mrs. Muller, Lewis said unexpectedly during a lull in conversation, I owe you an apology for my behavior when we arrived. My comments were unprofessional. The admission clearly cost him some pride, and Elsa suspected Sullivan might have had a private word with him. Nevertheless, she appreciated the gesture. Thank you, Captain, she replied simply. These are difficult times for all of us. The Major tells us you're working at the Civil Affairs Office now, Lewis continued. How are the locals responding? With mixed feelings, Elsa admitted. Some are grateful for the assistance, others see any cooperation with American authorities as betrayal. Can't really blame them, Garcia commented. Pride's a powerful thing, especially after defeat. It goes beyond pride, Elsa explained. For years, Germans were told that Americans were enemies, materialistic, corrupt, bent on destroying German culture. Those beliefs don't disappear overnight. And what do you believe, Mrs. Muller? Sullivan asked quietly. Elsa considered her answer carefully. I believe that people are more complex than propaganda suggests. Americans, Germans, individuals defy easy categorization. A diplomatic response, Sullivan observed with a hint of amusement. A truthful one, Elsa countered. My husband believed wholly in Germany's righteous cause until the day he marched east with his division. His last letters suggested his certainty was fracturing. Reality has a way of challenging even our most deeply held convictions. The mention of her husband created a momentary silence around the table. It was the first time Elsa had spoken of Friedrich so directly in their presence. Did you share your husband's convictions? Lewis asked, his tone curious rather than accusatory. Elsa tensed at the question. It probed the guilt she carried daily, the silence she had maintained through years of escalating darkness. I believed in Germany, she said carefully, but I questioned many things that were done in Germany's name, quietly, privately, which is to say, ineffectively. Few had the luxury of open dissent, Sullivan repeated his earlier observation. So we told ourselves, Elsa replied, an edge in her voice, a comfortable justification for silence. The conversation shifted to safer topics after that, but Elsa was aware of Sullivan watching her with thoughtful consideration, as if reassessing her in light of this glimpse into her private regrets. The following weeks established a rhythm to their unusual household arrangement. Elsa worked mornings at the Civil Affairs Office, where her responsibilities gradually expanded as her value became apparent. Afternoons were spent maintaining the cottage and preparing meals for her American residents. In the evenings, she often retreated to her room with books, including several that Sullivan had lent her from his personal collection. One evening in early May, Elsa returned from the Civil Affairs Office to find an official notice posted on her door. It was written in both English and German, declaring that her property had been formally requisitioned for long-term use by occupation authorities. The document included details of monthly compensation, but made no mention of how long the arrangement would continue. Elsa removed the notice with trembling hands. Though the situation had been ongoing for weeks, seeing it formalized in cold, bureaucratic language made the reality of her position unavoidable. This was her parents' home, her inheritance, and now it belonged, at least temporarily, to the victorious Americans. When Sullivan returned that evening, Elsa confronted him with the notice. Were you aware of this? Sullivan examined the document. Yes, though I didn't know it would be delivered today. It's a formality, Mrs. Muller. Nothing will change in our arrangement. Nothing except that my home is now officially no longer my own, Elsa observed, unable to keep bitterness from her voice. It's still your home, Sullivan insisted. This simply formalizes the compensation and ensures you have legal protection as the property owner. Legal protection under whose laws? Certainly not German law. Sullivan sighed. under the provisional government established by Allied authorities. I understand this is difficult, but it's actually meant to protect you. Without this document, someone with more influence could simply claim your home, and you would have no recourse. Someone with more influence, Elsa repeated. You mean someone like Margot Weber? Her husband was a high-ranking party official. I've seen her watching the house, calculating its value now that the previous order has collapsed. Mrs. Weber has made inquiries at the property office, Sullivan confirmed. She's claimed that several properties, including yours, should be reassigned based on political reliability. The revelation stunned Elsa. And you didn't tell me? I handled it, Sullivan replied simply. Her request was denied. This document ensures it will continue to be denied. Your home is protected precisely because it's already requisitioned. Elsa stared at him, trying to process the implications. So you're protecting me by occupying my home? In a manner of speaking, yes. Sullivan met her gaze directly. The irony isn't lost on me, Mrs. Muller. Later that week, as Elsa worked at the Civil Affairs Office, an incident occurred that would profoundly alter her relationship with Sullivan. A group of German men entered the building, demanding to speak with American authorities about food rations, which had been reduced the previous day. The situation quickly became heated as more Germans joined the protest. Major Richards attempted to address the crowd, explaining that supply difficulties had necessitated temporary reductions. His explanation, translated by a nervous young interpreter, did little to calm the growing anger. "You feast while our children starve," shouted one man. "This is how American justice works?" Before Richards could respond, another protester spotted Elsa at her desk. There's the officer's widow who serves the Americans. Ask her how well she eats while working for our conquerors." Suddenly, Elsa found herself the focus of the crowd's anger, a convenient symbol of collaboration with the occupiers. Several men advanced toward her desk, their intentions unclear, but their hostility obvious. Without hesitation, Elsa stood to face them. "Yes, I am Elsa Müller," she acknowledged, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "And yes, I work with the Americans to help our people navigate this difficult time. What exactly would you have me do instead? Refuse to help translate your concerns? Reject work that allows me to feed myself?" Her direct confrontation temporarily stunned the protesters. In that moment of hesitation, Sullivan entered the office, quickly assessing the situation. "What's happening here?" he demanded, moving to stand beside Elsa. "A discussion about food rations," Elsa explained calmly, switching to English. "These men are concerned about the recent reductions." Sullivan addressed the crowd in German. "I understand your frustration. Food shortages affect everyone, including our own troops. We're working to improve distribution, but it takes time to rebuild infrastructure destroyed during the fighting." "Easy words from those who don't go hungry," one man retorted. Sullivan's expression hardened slightly. "I've seen starvation across Europe, sir. It's precisely what we're working to prevent here. But accusations and threats won't produce more food." He turned to Richards. "Major, I suggest we arrange for community representatives to meet with supply officers this afternoon. Complete transparency about our ration systems might help address some concerns." Richards nodded in agreement. "Excellent suggestion. Mrs. Muller, would you ask these gentlemen to select 3 representatives for a meeting at 1400 hours? The practical response diffused much of the tension. As the crowd began to disperse, the man who had singled out Elsa lingered, his expression still hostile. "You think you're safe because you hide behind American uniforms," he said quietly, "but they won't be here forever." Sullivan stepped forward. "That sounds remarkably like a threat, sir." "An observation, Major," the man replied before joining his departing companions. After the incident, Sullivan insisted on escorting Elsa home personally. They walked in silence for several minutes before Elsa finally spoke. "You didn't need to intervene. I was handling the situation." "You were handling it admirably," Sullivan acknowledged. "But that man's comment at the end crossed a line." "It wasn't the first threat I've received," Elsa admitted. "Margot Weber and her friends have made similar observations about the temporary nature of American protection." Sullivan stopped walking, turning to face her directly. Why didn't you report this? What would be the point? You can't arrest people for veiled implications, and doing so would only confirm their perception of American heavy-handedness. This isn't about American authority, Sullivan said, frustration evident in his voice. It's about your safety. My safety has been uncertain for years, Major, Elsa reminded him. Long before you arrived in Berchtesgaden. Sullivan resumed walking, his expression troubled. The man who threatened you, Hans Gruber, has a history. He was a minor party official before our arrival. We've been monitoring him as a potential instigator of unrest. Monitoring him? Elsa repeated. You mean spying on German civilians? We're responsible for maintaining order and security, Sullivan replied, not quite answering her question. People like Gruber, who use legitimate grievances to promote continued resistance, make reconstruction more difficult for everyone. They had reached the cottage by now, and Elsa paused at the gate. Thank you for your concern, Major, but I've survived far worse than Hans Gruber's disapproval. Sullivan studied her face with an intensity that made Elsa uncomfortable. You're a remarkable woman, Mrs. Müller. Most people in your position would be broken by now. Defeated, bitter, looking for someone to blame. Instead, you keep moving forward, building something from the ruins. His observation struck uncomfortably close to Elsa's private thoughts. She had indeed refused to surrender to bitterness, though some days the effort cost her dearly. I have no choice but to move forward, she replied simply. The past offers no refuge. That evening, after dinner had been cleared away, Sullivan approached Elsa with an unexpected request. Would you join me for a walk? There's something I'd like to discuss away from the house. Curious and slightly apprehensive, Elsa agreed. They walked in silence along the path that led from her cottage toward the surrounding hills, the beauty of the alpine twilight creating a surreal backdrop for their unusual relationship. When they were well away from the house, Sullivan spoke. I received orders today. I'm being transferred to Munich to assist with denazification efforts at the university there. The news caught Elsa by surprise, along with the realization that it affected her more than it should. When do you leave? 3 days from now, Sullivan replied. Captain Lewis will remain here as the senior officer in the house. Elsa nodded, processing the implications. Lewis was correct in his duties, but lacked Sullivan's sensitivity to the complexities of occupation. I see, thank you for informing me. There's more, Sullivan continued. I've recommended you for a position in Munich as well. The education department needs someone with your background to help evaluate faculty members at the university. It would be a significant promotion from your current role. Elsa stopped walking. You want me to leave Berchtesgaden? This is my home. It's an opportunity, Mrs. Müller, Sullivan explained. Munich offers better conditions, more substantial work, and frankly, a fresh start away from the hostility you've faced here. Hostility follows collaboration wherever it occurs, Elsa noted. Munich would be no different. Sullivan shook his head. In a larger city, with more diverse perspectives, your work would be seen differently. You would be part of rebuilding German academic life, not just translating occupation directives. Elsa resumed walking, her thoughts in turmoil. And would I be required to provide household services to American officers there as well? No, Sullivan replied firmly. You would have your own housing, separate from any military personnel. Your status would be fully professional, not domestic. The offer was tempting in ways Elsa hadn't anticipated. The prospect of meaningful work, of contributing to the resurrection of German intellectual life after its corruption under Nazi influence, appealed to her scholarly background. Yet leaving Berchtesgaden meant abandoning the last physical connection to her life before and during the war, the home she had shared with Friedrich, the garden her parents had planted. May I have time to consider? She asked finally. Of course, Sullivan assured her, but not too much time. I'll need your decision before I leave. As they turned back toward the cottage, Sullivan added, Whatever you decide, I want you to know that working with you these past weeks has given me hope for Germany's future. If reconciliation is possible between people like us, perhaps it's possible for our nations as well. The following day, as Elsa worked at the Civil Affairs Office, a commotion outside drew everyone's attention. A military jeep had arrived bearing news that spread rapidly through the town. Adolf Hitler was dead, having taken his own life in Berlin as Soviet forces closed in. Germany's unconditional surrender was expected within days. The news, though not entirely unexpected, created a strange atmosphere in Berchtesgaden. For some Germans, it marked the final collapse of the regime they had followed for 12 years. For others, it confirmed what they had already accepted: total defeat. The Americans moved with increased alertness, watching for any signs of unrest or violence that might accompany this definitive end. When Elsa returned home that afternoon, she found Sullivan waiting for her. "You've heard the news?" She nodded. "It's over then, truly over." "Yes," Sullivan confirmed, "though the aftermath is just beginning." They stood in awkward silence for a moment before Sullivan spoke again. "Have you considered the Munich position?" "I have," Elsa replied, "but I need to know something first. Is this offer based on professional assessment of my qualifications or personal concern for my welfare?" Sullivan considered her question carefully. "Both," he admitted finally. "Your qualifications are genuine, but my recommendation was influenced by concern for your situation here." His honesty was refreshing, if uncomfortable. "And what exactly is my situation, in your assessment?" "You're caught between worlds," Sullivan observed. "Too educated and independent for traditional German society, especially now as a widow. Too connected to the old regime to be fully trusted by occupation authorities. Yet you navigate both worlds with remarkable grace." The accuracy of his perception was unsettling. Friedrich had often made similar observations about her, noting that she never quite fit the role of an officer's wife despite her efforts. "I need to think further," Elsa said. "Recent events change many calculations." Sullivan nodded in understanding. "Of course." That night, alone in her room, Elsa contemplated the decision before her. Berchtesgaden represented safety, familiarity, and connection to her past. Munich offered new possibilities, meaningful work, and perhaps freedom from the domestic servitude that her current situation entailed. The thought of continuing to maintain a household for American officers after Sullivan's departure held little appeal, yet the prospect of leaving her home was equally daunting. She found herself thinking about Friedrich, wondering what he would advise. Their marriage had been one of mutual respect and genuine affection, unusual in its equality for their generation. He had encouraged her intellectual pursuits even when they conflicted with the increasing restrictions placed on women under the Nazi regime. "The world is changing, Elsa," he had told her before departing for the Eastern Front. "Whatever happens in this war, nothing will return to what it was before. We must be prepared to build something new from whatever remains." His words seemed prophetic now, as she faced a choice between clinging to remnants of the past or stepping toward an uncertain future. The next morning, Elsa arrived at the Civil Affairs Office to find it buzzing with activity. News of Germany's official surrender had arrived overnight, and the Occupation Administration was preparing for the transition from military to civilian governance. Major Richards greeted her with unusual warmth. "Ah, Mrs. Muller, I understand congratulations are in order. Major Sullivan has informed me of your new position in Munich." Elsa blinked in surprise. "I haven't yet accepted the position." Richards looked momentarily confused. "Oh, my apologies for the presumption. It seemed such an excellent opportunity. I assumed you would accept without hesitation." "It is an excellent opportunity," Elsa acknowledged, "but leaving one's home requires careful consideration." Throughout the day, Elsa found her thoughts returning to the choice before her. As she assisted German civilians with their queries, she observed how many were already looking toward the future rather than dwelling on recent defeats. Farmers discussed planting cycles, merchants inquired about reopening businesses, parents asked about schools. Life continued, adapting to new circumstances. When she returned home that evening, Elsa found Sullivan in the garden, examining her vegetable plants with interest. "How you've done remarkable things with limited resources," he observed as she approached. "These tomato plants are thriving despite the poor soil." "My mother taught me to garden during the First World War," Elsa explained. "Another time of scarcity." Sullivan straightened. "Have you made a decision about Munich?" "Yes. Elsa replied. I will accept the position. Relief flickered across Sullivan's face before his expression returned to professional neutrality. I think that's wise. The university needs people like you to help rebuild German academic life on better foundations. It's not about wisdom, Elsa clarified. It's about necessity. Berchtesgaden holds too many ghosts now, not just Friedrich, but the person I was during those years. The silence I maintained, the compromises I accepted. Perhaps Munich offers the chance to live differently. Sullivan nodded in understanding. When can you be ready to leave? I'll need a few days to make arrangements, Elsa replied. Will that work with your schedule? Yes, we can travel together to Munich on Saturday, Sullivan confirmed. Transportation has been arranged. The following days passed in a flurry of preparations. Elsa packed her most essential belongings, arranged for a trusted neighbor to watch over her house during her absence, and completed her duties at the Civil Affairs Office. She avoided telling most townspeople about her departure, not wanting to face additional accusations of abandonment or collaboration. On Saturday morning, an American military truck arrived to transport them to Munich. Lieutenant Garcia helped load Elsa's modest luggage, his expression a mixture of sadness and understanding. We'll miss your cooking, Mrs. Muller, he said with characteristic warmth. And your conversations. You made this place feel almost like a home. Captain Lewis offered a formal but sincere handshake. Good luck in Munich, Mrs. Muller. Your work here has been commendable. As the truck pulled away from the cottage, Elsa allowed herself one backward glance at the home that had witnessed so much of her life, childhood, marriage, widowhood, and finally, this strange period of coexistence with those who had once been enemies. Whatever awaited her in Munich, she knew that nothing would ever quite match the peculiar intensity of these weeks when the boundaries between victor and vanquished had blurred in unexpected ways. The journey to Munich took several hours, winding through a landscape scarred by war, yet still breathtakingly beautiful in the late spring sunshine. Sullivan sat beside her in the truck, occasionally pointing out features of interest. A medieval church that had somehow survived bombing, an ancient Roman bridge, a forest where German folklore placed sleeping heroes who would awaken in times of greatest need. Did you believe they would awaken during the war? Elsa asked, referring to the legendary figures. Sullivan smiled slightly. I'm a historian, Mrs. Muller. I believe in human agency, not sleeping heroes. The choices people make individually and collectively determine outcomes far more than mythology. Yet people crave myths, Elsa observed. The myth of German superiority, the myth of American freedom, these have power beyond rational assessment. True, Sullivan acknowledged. The challenge now is to build something based on reality rather than myth. Germany's reconstruction cannot rest on the same illusions that led to its destruction. They fell silent as the truck entered the outskirts of Munich, where the devastation of bombing campaigns became fully apparent. Entire blocks had been reduced to rubble, skeletal buildings stood with their interiors exposed to the elements, and people moved among the ruins like ghosts. I had heard it was bad, Elsa murmured, but seeing it— 71 bombing raids, Sullivan said quietly. Approximately 6,000 civilians perished. The city center was almost completely destroyed, yet amid the destruction, Elsa could see signs of renewal. Workers clearing rubble, makeshift markets operating from undamaged buildings, children playing in secured areas. Life persisted, adapting to circumstances that would have seemed unimaginable years before. The truck delivered them to a building requisitioned for American educational officers, where Sullivan would be stationed. Elsa's assigned quarters were in a separate facility for civilian employees, several blocks away. I'll accompany you there, Sullivan offered, after consulting with the administrative officer. As they walked through the damaged streets, Elsa found herself wondering about the future shape of their relationship. In Berchtesgaden, the roles had been clear: occupier and occupied, officer and requisitioned homeowner. Here in Munich, with both of them engaged in the work of reconstruction, the boundaries seemed less defined. Will we be working together at the university? She asked. Sometimes, Sullivan replied. My role focuses on institutional reforms, while yours will involve individual faculty assessments. But there will be overlap. They reached the building that would be Elsa's new home, a former apartment complex partly damaged but structurally sound. Her assigned room was small but private, with basic furnishings and a window overlooking a courtyard where someone had begun planting flowers in bomb craters. "It's not luxurious," Sullivan observed, "but it should be comfortable enough. And it's yours, not subject to requisition or shared with military personnel." Elsa set down her bag, absorbing the reality of this new beginning. "Thank you," she said simply. Sullivan hesitated at the door. "I should let you get settled. Perhaps we could meet for dinner tomorrow. I can introduce you to some of the education team." "I would like that," Elsa agreed. After Sullivan departed, Elsa unpacked her few belongings and stood at the window, watching twilight settle over the damaged city. Munich represented everything Friedrich had predicted, a world irrevocably changed, requiring new ways of living and thinking. The path ahead would not be easy, but it offered something Berchtesgaden could not, the possibility of building rather than merely surviving. In the months that followed, Elsa and Sullivan worked often in proximity, their professional relationship deepening into a friendship based on mutual respect and shared purpose. The university gradually reopened, purged of its most ardent Nazi supporters, but still struggling with questions of complicity and responsibility. Elsa's role in evaluating faculty members proved challenging but rewarding, as she helped distinguish between those who had embraced Nazi ideology and those who had merely accommodated it for survival. Sullivan, true to his historian's nature, approached denazification with nuance rather than rigid categorization. "We must distinguish between active perpetrators and passive participants," he often argued in planning meetings. "Otherwise, we risk alienating those whose expertise is essential for rebuilding." Their conversations over occasional dinners or walks through recovering Munich ranged widely, from immediate practical concerns to philosophical questions about collective guilt and individual responsibility. Elsa found in Sullivan an intellectual equal who challenged her thinking without dismissing her perspective. By autumn, as Munich began preparing for its first post-war academic year, Sullivan received new orders. He would be returning to the United States in December, his expertise needed to train officials for continued occupation duties. He shared the news with Elsa during one of their walks along the partially restored Englischer Garten. "My replacement arrives next month. Professor Williams from Columbia University. A good man, thoughtful and fair-minded." Elsa nodded, surprised by the hollow feeling the news created. "America needs its professors back, I suppose." "As does Germany," Sullivan replied. "Your work here has been invaluable, Elsa. The foundations you're helping to establish will shape German education for generations." It was the first time he had used her given name, a small but significant shift in their relationship. Elsa found herself wondering what might have developed between them in a different world, one not divided by recent enmity and painful history. "Will you return to Princeton?" she asked. "Eventually," Sullivan confirmed, "though I've been offered a role with the State Department first, helping shape educational policy in occupied territories. The experience here has been instructive." "For all of us," Elsa agreed. "I never imagined finding common purpose with an American, especially one in uniform." Sullivan smiled. "Nor I with the widow of a German officer. History takes unexpected turns, doesn't it?" In December, as Munich prepared for its first post-war Christmas, Sullivan departed for the United States. His farewell to Elsa was formal in public, but followed by a private moment that neither would forget. "Whatever happens next, remember that what you're doing matters," he told her. "Not just for Germany, but for the idea that reconciliation is possible even after the worst conflicts." "I'll remember," Elsa promised, "and perhaps someday, when the wounds of war have healed further, our paths will cross again, not as victor and vanquished, but simply as people who shared a moment of history." Sullivan nodded, his expression suggesting he understood the unspoken possibilities that circumstances had prevented them from exploring. "I would like that very much." 2 years later, as Germany began its remarkable recovery under the Marshall Plan, Elsa received a package from the United States. Inside was a book, a newly published history of the occupation's first year, with Thomas Sullivan's name on the cover. The inscription read simply, To E.M., who taught me that humanity persists even in history's darkest chapters, with admiration and hope for the future. T.S. Elsa placed the book on her shelf in the small Munich apartment that had become her home. She had never returned to Berchtesgaden, choosing instead to sell the cottage and embrace her new life fully. Her work at the university had expanded to include teaching literature again, helping a new generation of German students rediscover the voices silenced during the Nazi years. Sometimes, when walking through the increasingly rebuilt streets of Munich, Elsa would recall those strange weeks in 1945 when an American professor turned soldier had requisitioned her home and, in doing so, had helped her find a path forward from defeat and loss. Their brief intersection had changed both their lives, revealing the possibility of connection across seemingly unbridgeable divides. In the end, perhaps that was the most important lesson of the war's aftermath, that even amid ruins, human beings could recognize each other's essential humanity and work together towards something better than what had been destroyed. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.